Hi. Today we're here to talk about dissociative disorders, a category of mental health disorders in the DSM-IV text revision. We're going to start by talking about dissociation as a modern psychological construct, but also look at the history of dissociation across cultures and in history. We're going to spend some time talking about the causes of dissociative disorders, in particular its relationship with trauma and attachment. Then we'll spend some time looking at each of the dissociative disorders in the dissociative disorder category and talk about their primary features and the criteria for each of those diagnoses. We'll talk a little bit about the changes upcoming in DSM-IV to the dissociative disorders category. We'll talk a little bit about the challenges and limitations in making a diagnosis of a dissociative disorder. And then lastly, we'll talk about some of the treatment that's available for dissociative disorders. I hope you'll enjoy this video, and I look forward to talking with you some about dissociative disorders. Dissociations involve a disruption in the usually integrated features of consciousness, memory, identity, or perception, as described by the DSM-IV text revision. These functions usually allow for a seamless flow of information and experiences from one section of the consciousness to another. Now, someone who experiences a dissociation might see an event, but there's some sort of disturbance that prevents that from affecting their emotional centers, or it may not transfer to their memory appropriately. So they've experienced events that they have no recollection of, or they can recall an event but have no emotional connection to something that would normally be very effective or affective to them because of its importance or because of its traumatic nature. Examples of a dissociation might be a person who can recall an intensely personal and traumatic event such as a car accident or physical or sexual abuse, but has no emotional content or no emotional affect that they display with that, a numbing or a deadened state, or something that's grossly incongruent, laughing while describing something that you might expect would make them extremely angry or upset. Other events might be someone who displays some form of amnesia. They have no ability to recall something or only recall parts of an event. Again, with dissociation, it's typically centered around some traumatic incidents or events that are related to or trigger memories of a trauma. Or someone may have intense emotional experiences that aren't congruent with the things that they're describing or experiencing. History abounds with examples of altered conscious states across cultures and throughout history. Examples might include forms or accounts of possession, trance states, berserker rages, or other cultural phenomena that included or involved a transformed consciousness, such as taking on the personality, memories, or attitudes of an animal or a deceased relative. Dissociation as a modern psychological construct has its roots in dynamic psychiatry, which is a school of thought from the 18th and 19th century. Dynamic psychiatrists were attempting to investigate phenomena including spiritual trances, other states of being, neuroses, or psychotic episodes, and trying to determine which states were based on organic brain problems or functional mental illnesses. Psychoanalysis looked at dissociative symptoms as hysterias or neuroses, and viewed them as the effects of defense mechanisms such as repression or conversion, and labeled such events as psychogenic amnesia or conversion hysteria in that frame. And when you look at DSM-I, the explanations of dissociative symptoms are couched heavily in psychoanalytic terms as the reasoning for their origin. In DSM-II, dissociative symptoms were described as disorders of the senses or of the voluntary nervous system. This continues a trend by the early DSMs to try to describe the origins of psychological concerns or mental health disorders rather than attempting to describe them as purely categories or groupings of common symptoms. The language that we use to describe dissociative disorders currently has its origin in DSM-III describing dissociative symptoms as a disruption in the normally integrated processes of consciousness, memory, identity, and perception. Subsequent editions of the DSM have focused mainly on changing the criteria for which different disorders can be given, largely due to the fact that many of the disorders in DSM-III were considered to be very vague and could be applied over liberally to clients. Looking at the causes of dissociative disorders, research shows that dissociative disorders are most commonly caused by trauma, particularly trauma in childhood, being physical and sexual abuse. It's important to note that dissociative disorders can also result from intense emotional abuse or neglect, even in the absence of particular traumatic experiences. Though less common, adults can also develop dissociative disorders based on trauma following childhood experiences. And research also shows that ongoing or repeated trauma increases the likelihood in which a dissociative disorder will be developed. Attachment behaviors affect the ability of a person to regulate their mood. Research has shown that maternal interactions teach young children how to regulate their mood, self-soothe, and to regulate their behavior in response to stimulation or overstimulation. Exposure to increased stress hormones, particularly during the later stage of gestation, affect the ability of a child to regulate their own emotion, therefore causing affect dysregulation. And that exposure to increased stress hormone can come from a variety of sources, and therefore is not necessarily linked to attachment style on the part of the maternal figure.